Continuing our reading in Hellbent for Election by Phyllis Speshock, Chapter 7. I was aroused by the sound of gagging and sputtering. Said Alexis. Ghastly stuff. With one glance, it was obvious what he had been about. They are a sour variety, I said, and not nearly ripe. I wonder that Eve could have been tempted in such a fashion, he fussed. I should not have been. But Alexis, I said, you were just... No nonsense, he said. I would never have swallowed the thing. All your talk about human food yesterday aroused my curiosity, that's all. When I woke to see the undernourished thing bobbing above me, well, I plucked it down solely to discover how well-founded your human ado about this subject really is. If you ask me, much ado about less than nothing. I sighed, looking up at the morning sun. I would, of course, agree with you, Alexis, though none of my parents' relatives would. What have your parents' relatives to do with this now? I thought we had left them in the turnabout pursuit of each other's denominations. We had, Alexis, but that was many years later, after they chiseled away at my parents' marriage until there was nothing much left of it. Meantime, each group fervently followed its own teachings, with Della and me tugged back and forth between the two. That all came about after the sex, however. After the sex? Yes, Hellbent, I'm here to help you, but you will have to keep to the issue at hand. First now, what of the being tugged back and forth according to the teachings of each denomination? I drew a long breath. Well, this is of itself a quandary. For when I say that each followed its own teachings, I mean exactly that. The shepherd was hired, you see, to teach them. But first of all, he was met by a board of their peers and told what to teach them. If he showed signs of thinking for himself, he was naturally corrected. If he refused the correction, he was let out. Thus, you see, the members were taught what they wanted to be taught and heard what they wanted to hear. And the shepherd, to be a successful fellow at all, must necessarily be very elastic. I think all this was caught up somehow in what you and I would call tradition, a word both denominations despised because it framed a large portion of the dogma of the more formal sects. And if they disliked each other, you can see how zealously they pitted themselves against a body of worshipers holding tradition, a partner with the guidebook. And dear, said Alexis, but you mentioned a couple of times that they themselves did not stick to the guidebook. Of course not. But the other fellow's horn always honks louder. To get back to the two shepherds, though, each of them had the approval of his own flock, I take it? Yes and no, Alexis. If either had been a completely headstrong fellow and sought to teach exactly what was in the guidebook and not what they liked to think was in the guidebook, then he would have been dismissed, or if they had tired of him and felt he had become a bore. But since each had given the impression of agreeing more or less with the general lessons and only now and again snipped off a shot at them, displaying in his own life open shortcomings, well then, he was kept on and treated in like manner. It was a sort of armed truce, you see, with gossip and backbiting as the underground. But of course, this was carried on between members as well as between members and shepherd, and not all shepherds knew its true contents. Before we get to that, Alexis said, let's get back to you and Della and what happened to you at the hands of the relatives. I'm beginning to weary of this knot of a place. When we were just past 5, I said, my parents put an end to church attending. The shepherds ceased to be invited to Sunday dinner. The guidebooks were burned. Not that they ever read them anyway. And the relatives dropped in only intermittently, waving their arms and trying to convict everyone of sin, although Della and I were quite confused as to what sin actually was. It generally boiled down to the opposite of what they thought it was. At any rate, my mother's relatives said, think of the children. They must go to church. And my mother, with a gleam in her eye, said, yes, indeed, take them along. Then my father's relatives would say, Think of the children. They must go to church, to our church. And my father, baring his teeth, would say, by all means, take them along. And so it was that Della and I went one Sunday to one church and the next Sunday to the other. And since many of the teachings were quite opposite, we should have become quite insane had we attempted to absorb and practice both. The result was obviously that we set about living up to our names. We took in as little as possible and sat dreaming in the pews of an eternity excluding the whole lot of them, which is perhaps why I choose to this day to refer to them as my parents' relatives rather than my own. Della does likewise. I see, said Alexis, shifting his position. This situation prevailed then from the time you were 5 until you were 17? Yes, more or less. Though during the latter of those years we flared our nostrils and ran out to pasture and refused to be dragged along at all. That is, Della did. I often followed suit. We differed in this. We wanted none of churchiness at all. I kept harking back to the guidebook, wondering just how, all the gerrymandering came about. And what did the guidebook say? Unless I misunderstood completely, he was more concerned with stating the truth than with pleasantly tickling the ears of his audience. And unless I'm far off the track, his audience numbered into the several thousands, willing to walk for miles with no thought of food or cushioned compartments. When I was younger, I used to wonder how this could be. For all the proper folk would begin to open their watch cases and clear their throats and pull on their gloves when the lesson became too long, and then the shepherd would hurriedly dismiss them. By and large, Hellbent, Alexis said, you seem to have kept a level head on your shoulders and sorted out things befittingly. He arose, and I did likewise. No, Alexis, I did not sort as well as you think. I speak to you now as an adult, and still you feel I am in need of counseling. Think how much more in need I was as a child, beset by a profusion of hate and a bounty of contradictions, and all of them born out of very, very goodness. But then, you have caused me to skip over the most confusing part of all, my next most poignant recollection. Not at all, Hellbent. I am taking you there now, to your mother's bedroom. And that is the end of chapter 7.